me okay? I can't hear myself very well. Thank you for being here. Today, David and I, like you were told, are going to talk about mapping and how we can best use our resources to be efficient, concise, and accurate. Again, my name's Brittany George. I'm a partner at Weaver. We're a public accounting firm. I'm based in the Dallas office. This is my 14th year with the firm, but I have been in IT audit and or compliance my entire career. And a fun fact about me is that I love traveling. I've visited 38 countries and hope to keep increasing that number. David?
I'm David Friedenberg. I'm a senior manager with Weaver. I've been with the firm about 7 years now, but that's only about half of my total experience between IT, audit, and compliance consulting. I have not been as world-wise as Brittany quite yet, but I have drank many more craft beers, and I consider myself a little bit of a connoisseur. We won't say that it has anything to do with the job.
So today we're going to talk about the issues that we face, the issues that are common when it comes to dealing with multiple compliance initiatives, how to approach mapping in your organizations and for your clients. We'll go through some case studies and then some examples of reporting as well. You've got issues. Does anybody in here have issues? One person has, oh great, just not very many of you have issues. The common issues that we do see with our clients whenever we're doing assessments center around scope, scalability, expertise, and fatigue of the audit. From a scoping perspective, just like we do with PCI when we're doing a scoping exercise, it's very important, and you have to get your arms around what you're looking at. So part of the scoping when you're dealing with multiple compliance initiatives is identifying the applicable frameworks, standards, requirement, control sets, and identify the overlap of the regulations and how that's going to impact your environment. That's a huge challenge that we see for a lot of our clients. Scalability. So due to the large number of applicable regulations and trying to identify and understand what those are and how those map to our in-scope environments, ensuring that we're able to scale up, scale down whenever we're adding new requirements or regulations and then ramping down when something maybe becomes not applicable in our environment. Expertise. We all know about the staffing shortages. So even within the technical resources that we have, ensuring that we have staff that are familiar and understand the frameworks and regulations that we must adhere to internally, and then also maintaining that knowledge through turnover, retirements, advancements, and just general transfers. Now, one of the things that we see over and over again is the fatigue that the audit teams that we deal with encounter. They are over-audited and they are over it. That causes personnel to, pull data over and over again, sometimes the exact same data within a short period of time, and that's in addition to their real job, right? I found an interesting statistic that said, if it were a country, US regulation would be the world's 8th largest economy. Think about that, the 8th largest economy, just US regulation alone. So if you add on an organization that's global, you continue to increase that compliance responsibility. It's a heavy burden to bear. There's a plethora of compliance initiatives out there, as we know. PCI, obviously, since we're here. How many attendees have their own internal or have clients with compliance initiatives they have to adhere to that are in the range of 2 or more? 2 or more compliance initiatives. Okay, there's several. So most organizations have to comply with a variety of industry, legal, security-related, regulatory requirement standards and or frameworks. Some of the common ones that we see, obviously, we're here at PCI, so PCI, some other frameworks we see often are NIST, ISO, SOC 2, CIS, HIPAA, HITRUST, the list goes on. And regulatory considerations such as SOX for publicly traded companies, FFIEC for the banking industry, and then others. We're here in Canada, so the Canadian Center for Cybersecurity has an assessment, FedRAMP, CSA, CCPA in California, FERPA, CMMC, plus an organization's internal controls they must adhere to. It's a lot, right? And so there's organizations that are very large, right? So large enterprises may offer over 100 services. And they may have to operate, or do operate, in 18 different countries. So by that count, they could be responsible for adhering to 10 to 15 global and then 35 location-specific compliance assessments. You probably know who some of these organizations are. You may belong to some of these organizations. But the compliance responsibility, notice I didn't say burden, the responsibility applies to organizations of all size. Now, David's going to talk about some of the art and science of mapping.
So for the cartography of this, you're really going to do multiple steps. You can't just go right into it, do it all at once. You've got to prepare for these things in advance, otherwise you won't have success. So the first thing you need to do is identify what is applicable. Now that's going to be multiple different levels. You need to identify things like what are your frameworks, what are your regulations, where do you have contractual obligations? You need to identify what systems will be applicable. You need to take a look and see which business units and process owners those are going to apply to. Once you know what's applicable, you can start articulating what's dependent on something else. What has to go first in order for all of these things to be successful? Do you have to do the largest engagements first and then trickle down from there? That's going to gain you the most efficiencies. You're going to have to coordinate for your subject matter experts. You cannot do these things in a vacuum. A compliance person by themselves is never going to understand the systems as well as you would if you were the person hands-on day to day. You need those knowledgeable personnel that can tell you, yes, this applies and here's how, or no, this doesn't apply and here's why not. Once you've got your SMEs in line, then you've got to figure out how you're going to document this and where you're going to document this. So do I want to use a GRC tool? Do I want to put it in Excel? Hopefully you're not scratching this down on a notepad and just putting it in a drawer somewhere, because that's going to be a little harder to modify later. There are definitely some automated solutions out there, but one thing to understand is where you have these automated solutions, it's not a plug and go. There are going to be many, many man-hours that you have to put in that manual effort to identify what applies to me, where it applies, plug that into the system before you start to get that information back in a usable fashion. So while they still add the value, you need to understand that it's not going to be instant gratification on those. Once you've done the prep, then you can go into the actual mapping itself. So start with the most robust frameworks. If you've got, I'm going to use PCI and HIPAA. PCI is a far more robust framework from a requirements standpoint than HIPAA is at present. I think we're looking at 300 plus requirements in 4.0, and there's 48 safeguards in HIPAA security right now. So you would start with PCI, and you would map in HIPAA to PCI. You would do it one regulation or framework at a time to avoid that sense of too much. So after you've gotten through layering it in, you're going to have some items that are left over. You're not always going to have total overlap. We'll get into a case study in a little bit that'll tell you exactly how much, but if you have some that don't match up, that's fine. Add them to the bottom, continue mapping. Something else may match up to those later. If not, you've still got it in your matrix. Once you've got all of your frameworks, all of your regulations, the next step is the piece that becomes organization specific. You get to map in your organization's controls, your processes. That's going to be what makes this yours. That's how it applies to your systems, your people, your processes. Then you have to own that mapping. And this is where it gets complicated for a lot of people. You may have leveraged somebody else's mapping to start. There are many out there that say, regulation A, regulation B, here's how they're interchanged. But once you add in those organizational controls, once you've modified things to be specific for you, it's now yours. You have to own it. You have to keep it up. You have to make sure that people agree with your mapping. You've got to go to those stakeholders and make sure that they say, yes, this is accurate, this is complete, this is how it should be for us. And that's just the beginning.
So there's upkeep, right? Like David said, this is not a one and done. You don't just set it and leave it. Unfortunately, there is care and attention that needs to be given to all of the controls that you're required to adhere to and the resulting mapping. You need to have somebody that is responsible for the accuracy and the completeness of the mapping. And one of those responsibilities is to periodically check for updates and clarifications to the standards and frameworks, whether that's new FAQs or new versions. You have to have a point person or a point group that is responsible for that. You also need to confirm if there are new laws, regulations, standards, whatever it is, and if they're applicable to your environment, and then apply those as applicable to your existing mapping. So there has to be a continuous, ongoing cycle here. We also need to ensure that any changes to the organization's environment, whether that's the architecture, infrastructure, whatever that may be, that those changes are taken into consideration. It's essentially a change management exercise. We have to see that there's applicability for whatever those environmental changes are, since we do know that the state of risk and compliance is ever changing. And so if you do make a change, how is that going to affect the regulations, the mappings that you currently have? David mentioned ensuring that there is a logic that exists for the why of the mapping. You just can't take it for granted. There's freely available mappings online. AICPA has some, CMMC, CSA, and they map to a plethora of different frameworks and standards. But you can't just take those blindly and then apply them. There has to be some thought. You have your own internal controls to consider and how those map to PCI and others. And so there's due diligence to be done, and it is going to take a lot of man hours. David mentioned the tool. Sometimes I think it's underestimated, even with a tool, the setup that it takes. I have seen that occur time and time again. So give yourself enough time when you're implementing a tool, if you are doing that, to ensure that you have the right people and the correct amount of time slated. Obviously, we have to do regular confirmation of that mapping. That should actually, in my opinion, be a control that you have internally. So annually or when updates are made, that should sound like a similar control that you've heard before. Ensure that the mapping is accurate, and you may have to do that in a very manual process. One piece of good news that I have, well, I have lots of good news, but one piece I'm going to share with you is there's an organization called NAVIX Global, and they found that the number of mature and advanced risk and compliance programs grew by 29%, while the number of reactive and basic ones declined by 35%. So we're going in the right direction, but we have to, again, be intentional and keep that a part of our continuous monitoring. Some key takeaways before we move into the case studies are tools do not take the place of good processes, because processes change and they should be regularly reviewed. Obviously, if you're utilizing a tool, utilize workflows, understand what data is where, what you have, who the framework, process, and control owners are. Have a dedicated team. A cross-functional compliance team is imperative for standing up, implementing, and maintaining multiple compliance initiatives and the associated mapping. We have to have the people in place, the internal policies, processes, procedures, and tools. Obviously, the more controls and people and documentation you have, the more likely you'll need to consider an automated tool. And there are pros and cons to that from a cost perspective, scalability, limitations overall. Overkill, if you're just a smaller organization and you have 2 frameworks you have to adhere to, tool might not be the best option for you. And you have to consider storage and documentation. And then consider the timing of audits, like we talked about. Make sure that the order and the timing of audits are going to provide you with the most efficient and practical use of your time and resources. And then shift your mindset. Again, this has got to be a process that is baked in to just your normal everyday control activity. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to David. He's going to go through some case studies.
Okay, so story time. No, I'm kidding. We're going to start pretty low level. The hands-on items give you an idea what we're talking about here. So in this one, we've got password requirements. Now, every regulation, every standard out there is going to have a different thing. You can see on here, we've got PCI has something different from NIST 853, ISO, SOC 2s, etc. The component here that's important to understand and important to remember is when you're mapping across multiple different standards, you need to pick the most stringent requirement to enforce where it's applicable. So what we've got up here is some bolded text. You can see which ones are the most restrictive for those scenarios. And there's really 2 scenarios here, when you have multi-factor authentication and when you don't. Where you have multi-factor authentication, you're going to have a lower password length requirement based on this set of standards. So if you have MFA, they're only going to require 12, which is PCI DSS 4.0. If you do not have it, then the longest is going to be the CIS requirement for 14 characters. Now, in all of these scenarios, the most restrictive from a complexity standpoint is going to be the HITRUST, where they require upper, lower, number, and special characters. So you'll really come out with 2 sets of things to enforce. There's the 14 or the 12 with upper, lower, number symbol, whether or not you have the MFA in place. Now, taking it up a little bit, we go into the process level. On processes, what I'm really going to focus on here is logging, because there's different components to logging. First, you have to actually have logs being generated by your systems. Now, if you take a look down on the technical standards or safeguards for HIPAA, you'll see the first one there is audit logging, and it maps to PCI requirement 10. But you'll also probably have already noticed that log monitoring, which is an administrative safeguard for HIPAA, also maps to requirement 10 in PCI. Now, what this should tell us is you may not always have a one-to-one. You may have a one-to-one, a one-to-many, or a many-to-many. And that's okay, because that's how it has to be based on the processes that are applicable to these regulations. You will, however, get some overlap. Talked about it earlier, there's 300 and change requirements in 4.0. There's 48 in HIPAA. If you do a high-level mapping like that, you'll see that 38 of the HIPAA safeguards actually map almost directly into something for PCI. That gives you nearly 80% coverage if you do the PCI assessment first and leverage the testing for HIPAA. And what it looks like on a project level is something like this. You go through, figure out what your scope is, you do your gap or your assessment for PCI, you analyze what the difference in scopes is, and then you go from there on HIPAA, only testing that difference because you're going to cover the rest as part of the PCI assessment. So doing all of this, you have to report it to your stakeholders. So a couple of things real quick. Begin with the end in mind. Know who you're talking to, know what kind of information they need, and how they best consume that information. You're going to get better use out of graphics than walls of text. Send it to them in a format they can understand, whether that's a dashboard, an email, or a conversation, and send it to them at a frequency that's best for them, whether that's daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on how much depth they need. This is a good example for project teams. You've got detailed out by requirement, by safeguard, a lot to consume. You can give them an overall. But when you get to the executives, you want something a little more like this with the higher level green, yellow, red indicators, and you go from there. And that's mapping in a nutshell.
Thank you for your attendance. We're thankful you're here. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to find David or I. You can add us on LinkedIn or shoot us an email if you'd like to discuss anything further or pick our brains. Thank you.
Thank you.